At Odds and Ends by Corn Dog _ Patrol and For the Wolfie. Chapter 23 Overhaul's Soiree. That morning, when Shouta finally woke, he was still held in Hisashi's arms, although the blonde must have been up at some point since they've both been cleaned. He looked up at Hisashi's face and felt soft when he saw him. His eyes were closed, his expression utterly peaceful. The moment was ruined, however, when he remembered what today was. Shouta pulled himself from Hisashi's arms and got up, finding his clothes neatly folded on the nearby desk. He tried to dress quietly, but before he had the chance to finish, a voice softly asked, "How are you feeling?" He turned to see Hisashi sitting up in bed, watching him sleepily. Light was pouring in from the windows, and they'd forgotten to pull the curtains off the bed around. So Hisashi seemed to glow in the morning sun. It was early, but they had a big day ahead. "I'm fine," Shouta said, and it wasn't a lie. His limbs felt a bit heavy and his neck was sore, but apart from that, he felt normal. "You?" Hisashi grinned, not even trying to hide his fangs. "Amazing." Shouta nodded, and looked away so he could finish getting dressed. However, he heard Hisashi get up from the bed and walk behind him. He automatically tensed, but didn't turn around. "This'll be a happy day," Hisashi said softly, as he wrapped his arms around Shouta from behind and pressed his face against his back. They smelled of each other. Shouta relaxed and leaned into the warmth as he took Hisashi's hand and squeezed it. "I haven't let myself think about what he's been doing to her. It'll end today." He nodded, and they stood there for a time, still in the soft embrace. Hisashi stared at himself in the mirror. He was dressed to the nines, all ready for the soiree of the season. He wore a green coat, with the front that ended at his waist, and his hair was tied to suit the sleek top hat. "Well, well, well," said an eager voice that was paired with the sound of the door swinging open. Hisashi didn't need to turn around to know it was Nemuri. "Someone's ready for a performance." "It's gonna be all or nothing," Hisashi told her, putting on the black slash of material that would become his bow tie. "Could you help me with this, please?" Nemuri moved beside him, and defiantly did his bow tie, ensuring the ends puffed neatly. "By the sounds of it, someone had an amazing night." He felt the blood rush to his cheeks. "Shouta figured I'd be a better asset if I was well fed." It was true. Hisashi could feel the energy flowing his veins. At least he didn't feel guilty about it this time. He looked at himself again in the mirror and continued to fuss with his outfit. "Are the preparations complete?" "Of course. All that's left is you and Shouta." Nemuri offered him her arm, and he felt the composure soften, especially when she said, "You look handsome." "Thank you. You don't think Shouta would feel offended that I'm dressed so nicely for overhaul's soiree, right?" She rolled her eyes and stopped waiting for him to take her arm, instead taking his by force as she tugged him towards the door. "He's just up too, stupid. Isn't that the whole point of blending in? Wow, you go weird when you're in love." Hisashi forced a smile, but then they were both in the foyer, where Shouta was already waiting for him, and he was so handsome that he took Hisashi's breath away. Shouta was wearing the same outfit he'd worn for Hakamada, with the black and red waistcoat, gray suit jacket, and the Hambrada hat, although his hair was tied up in a low ponytail, and he shaved. The mere sight of him made Hisashi's heart ache with yearning. Here was what he could taste, but never have. Shouta saw him, paused, and looked down at his own shiny shoes. "Are you ready?" "Yeah," Hisashi said, managing his best smile, although Shouta refused to look up and see it. They stood in silence, both unwilling to move, until Oboro busted through the entrance, dressed in his own formal wear. "The car is ready!" he shouted eagerly, failing to read the room. You ready to head over to Overlord's place? Overhaul, Tensei corrected. He must have been in the room the entire time, but Shouta had been too distracting for Hisashi to notice anyone else. Khan was in the room too, his expression sour, although he said nothing. I believe we're all ready. You take Shouta and Hisashi in the car, while All Might will be here soon in his own car to take the rest of us to the rendezvous point. Sounds great. Obara held the door open for them and eagerly bowed. Right this way, my lords. Hisashi didn't have the heart to tell him Shouta wasn't a lord, especially since the Slayer was the first one to turn and exit the room. As he did so, Hisashi's hand reached for him as an unvoiced fear gripped his heart. Was this the last time he'd ever see Shouta and his mare? He was framed by the iron wolvery doorway, his back to him, while his face was hidden, turned towards the unknown. Hisashi's hand grabbed empty air. Already, the man he loved was out of his reach. Had he ever truly been within his reach? Hisashi closed his fist and squared his shoulders. A child was in danger. Her safety was more important than his feelings, and so it was his job to do anything he could to help her. Until then, it'll be best to bury these feelings deep, where they wouldn't be able to distract from the one goal. He bit his lip at the sheer impossibility of it, but it took the first step forward, all the same. Everything felt like a blur after that. Climbing into the front seat, the torturous slow journey, made longer by the number of cars and carriages lined up outside an exquisitely cold castle, and Obero finally pulling up to the entrance. Then the door was opened by one of Overhaul's servants, and the world came back into sharp focus. As he stepped out of the car, his head automatically turned upwards, forcefully beholding the towering monarch that was Overhaul's home. The sweeping sight made his world feel infinitesimal. How would they find one little girl in this labyrinth? Hisashi sensed Shota's presence, but when he was finally able to tear his eyes from the tower, he was surprised to notice that Shota's eyes were focused on the door straight ahead. A flood of courage rumbled inside him. The servant, who had opened the car door, also pulled the two cases from the trunk, a violin case and a cello case. Without being prompted, the servant fell into step behind the duo, carrying both instruments for them. Obero waved and was forced to drive away. Although there were other guests arriving around them, Hisashi felt as if he and Shouta were all alone. They marched up the stepping stones that led to the gaping maw of the entrance room, where servants stood to collect invitations and to check bags for anything silver, any annoying necessary for a vampire soiree. Hisashi and Shouta were accepted easily into the mansion, thanks to the invitation brought by Colossus, although they held their breaths as their instrument cases were checked. Surprisingly, the investigation wasn't particularly thorough. All they did was open some of the side cases and ensure the instruments were both empty of any obvious weapons. They were cleared quickly and given an approximate time to perform. However, a servant offered to take the instruments behind the stage for them, and they were forced to agree to avoid suspicion. Hisashi didn't doubt there would be a more thorough search behind closed doors, and he hoped that they'd both been smart enough in their schemes to avoid detection. The case were carried away, and the duo was led into the ballroom, where they entered from a high vantage point that overlooked everyone. Introducing Lord Yamada Hisashi and his professional donor. Some polite applause greeted them as they descended the staircase. The room was full of so many vampires that even Hisashi felt dizzy, meaning Shouta must have felt possibly claustrophobic. The donors always stood out in the crowds, thanks to their skimpy outfits, mellow expressions, and bitten necks. They wore the two dots like a badge of honor. Hisashi kept Shouta close, especially when vampires began to push their way to his side. Most of them were young women with noble vampire bloodlines, all interested in meeting and potentially wooing the most desired bachelor of the year. He was polite enough, playing his typical role with ease, although they wondered how Shouta must have felt about the sight. However, the human was looking away the entire time, his demeaned expression easily confused with sheer boredom by the refined Shouchales. Thankfully, this meant the vampires ignored him. There was no sight of their gracious host, but a band was playing, and when Hisashi needed a break from socializing, he tugged Shouta towards the dance floor. He came easily, although his mind was clearly elsewhere, busy scanning the defenses and the guard's location for a future breakout. This time, Shouta remembered to put his hand on Hisashi's shoulder rather than his waist. Hisashi grinned, and Shota's eyes finally focused on him. Hmm? You remembered, Hisashi said, shrugging as they fell into step with the music. With how proper everyone at this place seems to be, I figured it's best not to spark extra controversy. Shota's voice was soft, so no one else could hear. Only now did Hisashi notice just how nervous the human was. His eyes were darting, his skin felt clampy, and his pulse was uneven. Still, he was doing amazingly considered the mess-up circumstances. It's bright in here, he added. You teach the torches to burn bright, Hisashi remarked, but Shouta just looked confused. Sorry, nervous humor. He glanced up at the chandeliers, with their burning candles and melted wax. Despite the warmth, the unused ballroom from Hisashi's home felt worlds more inviting than this reclaimed cage. They danced 2 songs in silence, without a word passing between them. Shota's eyes continued to glance through the room, at everywhere other than Hisashi, although Hisashi was busy trying to spy overhaul amongst the spectating thralls. If they were being watched by his henchmen, it was impossible to tell with the crowd. Eyes were definitely on them, but many of those were socialties, wondering how long he would dance with his pet. The 3rd song started. Their dance continued. I love you, Hisashi said softly, as he leaned his head against Shota's shoulder, masking his lips so that no one else could figure out what he said. No matter what happens, I want you to know that. Shouta was silent. Nothing more needed to be said. The song soon ended, and they finally stopped, returning to the chattery clamor of the other guests. Others asked Hisashi to dance, but he claimed he was tired, and twice had to explain he wanted to keep Shouta company since it was his first soiree. They'd never seemed too disappointed. Having a professional donor, and taking care of him thoughtfully, was just another feather in Hisashi's cap. Soon, however, it was time to prepare for the performance. They moved to the stage and found their instruments in the wing, still packed. Hisashi held his breath as they snapped the cases open, and then exhaled it with relief. Nothing had been taken or replaced. The instruments had already been tuned that morning, so it was just a matter of taking them out and setting up. Hisashi's eyes drifted to the end pinpoint of Shota's cello. It looked like it needed a wipe down, but that was due to the scented gel they used to mask the smell of silver, the same one Tensei had used to hide his own blades. Hisashi hid his relief by asking Shouta, Are you confident? Shouta continued to set up the instrument, his movements methodical. If he was still nervous, it was impossible to tell right now. Confident enough. If you're lost, just focus on the music, he encouraged, rather than the crowd. I'm not too concerned, Shouta emphasized as he stood up from the case, drawing his instrument with him. No one will notice me when you play. Hisashi's face felt warm from the way Shouta said it. It wasn't a compliment. He spoke it as a fact. Are you ready? Ready to greet the devil himself. There was applause beyond the curtains, and then they were joined by the exiting band. The players were exhausted, yet relieved to be out of the spotlight. One even clapped Hisashi on the back to wish him luck, before they disappeared amongst their fellow performers. For a moment, Hisashi thought he spied a hint of blonde hair, but he didn't pay it any further attention. The vamp took Hisashi's hand in his, giving it one reassuring squeeze, and then stepped out of the wings. The stage radiated with the warmth of the spotlights. There was a distinct smell of sweat, barely masked by the vases of curdling flowers. Although the blazing lights above were blinding, the eyes of the audience members bore into his soul. Every step felt like a mine as he accepted the attention of the central spotlight. Seconds later, he was at its center, staring down the crowds. Hisashi's heart hammered in his chest, a rhythm that could never hope to match with his music. His throat felt dry, but he hid his fears behind a polite smile and a fury of gestures. "Welcome to the party," he called to those who listened. "I am Hizashi Yamada, here to perform for you on the violin. I shall be duetting with Shouta, my professional donor, on the cello. He's still new at this, so please go easy on him." The listeners stirred at the detail. Quiet murmurs pawed at his ears, but he paid them no mind. Overhaul was nowhere in sight. Yet Hisashi felt his perceptive gaze somewhere nearby. The villain's words buzzed through his mind. "Hopefully your blood bag changes his mind. I look forward to having you attend at the very least. We'll talk more." "Ready?" said a voice behind him. Hisashi glanced over his shoulder. Shouta was sitting behind him, cello at the ready. His body was slouched forward. The smothering spotlights cast down showers over his face. However, his eyes caught the light and flared with sharp determination. They were ready. The nerves of the moment slid away. Hisashi turned back to the crowd and beamed as he readied his violin. This first piece, ladies and gentlemen, is called The Devil's Trail Sonya by Tarni. A hush fell. Despite the ocean of people before him, no sound existed except for him, his violin, and Shota's cello. His love was behind him, and that knowledge brought an overwhelming sense of comfort. Once all eyes were on them, Hisashi began to play. The song started moose. The notes trilled with a dreamlike quality. Hisashi's body moved slowly to the tune, taking 2 steps forward and swaying gently as his hands and bow danced over the strings. It was easier to close his eyes as he played, to allow himself to become lost in it. When he did, it felt like the audience was less. In fact, before tonight, he always imagined only 2 people watching him, his mother and father. It was an old memory, from when he'd been a talented child who'd been thrilled to perform for them. It was back before he lost his mother, and before the image of his father had become that of a monster. When they had been his adoring parents, alive and full of love. He no longer remembered what they wore, or whether their eyes had been opened or closed as they listened to him, but he could recall vividly their distinct smiles. 2 people watched him again tonight, but they weren't his parents. One was Shouta, who sat behind him like a protective shield. The sound of his cello was soft compared to Hisashi's violin, but it was there all the same. He'd never played a public duet before, and although Shota's notes were simple and slow, the sound they made together was rich and complete. However, the other person who watched was like a nightmare. Their eyes were bird-like and filled with a space where Shouta wasn't. Tonight, Hisashi played for them. Tonight, Hisashi played for 2 different devils. The fire that lit inside him made the second movement of the Sonya cut through the first like a knife. Sweat beading his face, his body swayed more quickly from side to side. Shouta kept up with the quickened pace. He'd always imagined the second movement as being happy, but now he pictured a man signing away his soul to a charismatic devil. For a brief moment, he wondered what was given in exchange. But then, he tuned into Shota's cello again, and he knew. The third movement began with deep regret that muddied every note from his instrument. Hisashi bowed his head more as he played, finally opening his eyes to watch his fingers playing the notes as the sounds became desperate and pleading. His body moved more frantically, swaying and shifting from side to side. The sound of it echoed across the room. He took one look at the audience and saw how rapt they were in his violin sound, now completed by Shota's cello. Good. The tune softened momentarily. The spotlight felt hot as it refracted off his violin's surface. He was still sweating, more so than before, but it only grew worse as the song proceeded, and he started to push his entire body into the movements of his bow. The cello was silent behind him for this section. Shouta was surely watching him from behind, keeping him safe as he played his heart out. Slim threads from his bowstring dangled, but they'd been worn to severings, ghosting over his face and fingers. He bobbed his head in concentration as his solo neared its conclusion, and his heart leapt with joy when he heard Shota's cello finally rejoin him for the final. Hisashi's eyes felt wet. As soon as he played the final note, he pulled the bowl away, held it high for several moments, and then let himself lower his instrument. There was silence. Hisashi raised his head, letting the sun of the spotlight hit his face. All he could do was stand there and simply breathe. The applause came moments later, defying as echoes around the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. Hisashi turned his head. Shota's eyes were large as he looked out in the audience, mesmerized, his face glistening with sweat too, and the shadows were gone as he leaned back. Hisashi couldn't stop himself from grinning like a madman. Their eyes met, and despite everything, Shouta Aizawa smiled too. Their performance continued, with song after song. Even Hisashi's brilliant ability slipped into being background noise for the ballroom, although he didn't particularly mind. Eventually, however, their time was up. Hisashi played one final song with Shouta accompanying him, and they received a final round of applause before they departed the stage. The duo slipped into the wings, and if there hadn't been another group of musicians waiting, Hisashi might have pulled Shouta into a kiss. "You were amazing," Hisashi said instead, although it did little to capture how amazed he truly was. "It was all you," Shouta said. He didn't waste any time on congratulations, however, as he immediately bent down to pack away the cello. Hisashi crouched next to him, in dealing with his own instrument, helping to cover Shota's action from anyone who might have been watching. The slayer pulled the end point from the cello and held it for just a moment. The sharp silver seemed to sparkle, even in the darkness of the backstage. It had once been a silver knife, given to Shouta by Hakamata, although they had to melt it down and reshape it for the night. The end pin would be the only weapon Shouta had in his rescue operation, but it would have been enough. Hisashi watched as it disappeared into Shota's waistcoat, out of sight, with the gel still covering its scent, so the vampires would never notice. Their cases clicked shut, and they were left behind. Time to greet the crowd. As soon as they left backstage, they were swarmed by the audience. Just as they predicted, attention was focused solely on Hisashi as they asked him the same 20,000 questions about his violin performance. His answer never changed, but he handled each one as if it was the first time he'd ever heard it. 20 minutes into the rambling, Shouta was gone. He must have been doing a good job if even Hisashi hadn't noticed the slayer slinking away. He regretted not wishing him good luck when they had been backstage. Now it was too late. The questions continued to fire at him, and he acted normally until he was distracted by a specific voice. "Mr. Yamada!" The people parted. From between them stepped an imposing figure with purple feathers wrapped around his neck and a beak-shaping mask obscuring his mouth. His eyes were as sharp as a bird's of prey. "Overhaul," Hisashi said with a smile. "I haven't seen you all night. I hope you saw the performance." "I've been busy," said the vampire, his head bobbing like a bird's. "Forgive me." I did hear you play, at least. You know your instrument well. Thank you for the chance to play. It's not every day I have such a large audience. Your blood bag did a fine job as well, he pointed out, more slowly, and then added, although there were a few times he played the wrong note. He's still new to the cello. I'm sure that by the time we next perform, he'll be perfect. Of course. I didn't mean it as an insult. Forgive me. I meant to say that he played well for a human. Hisashi had no idea how anyone could sound so rude, even while speaking so politely. I'm glad he was able to join us after all. Overhaul's eyes scanned left, then right, before settling back on Hisashi. Although, he seems to be somewhere else right now. Hisashi laughed sheepishly, trying to figure out whether or not Overhaul knew exactly what was going on. Sorry, I was so busy chatting with these divine listeners. Shouta must have snuck off to get a drink or go to the bathroom. I keep him on a bit of a loose leash. A bad habit, that. Overhaul straightened his shoulders, even though he hadn't been slumping, and he gestured with his head. Come with me, Mr. Yamada. I wish to pay you for tonight, but I left my checkbook in my study. Let's discuss payment somewhere more private. Hisashi felt cold. Going anywhere alone with Overhaul was trouble, plain and simple. But if he refused, then it might cause a scene. You don't have to pay me a cent, Hisashi assured. A line of sweat rolled down his forehead, and he hoped everyone thought it was due to his earlier performance. You invited me, after all. I'd never expect someone to your caliber to play without payment. Come. Overhaul wasn't backing down. Hisashi swallowed, but he didn't let his smile fall for a moment. If he continued to resist, then Overhaul would know something was up for certain. At least if Hisashi kept the vampire busy, then Shouta would have more time to rescue Eri from his clutches. Right, Hisashi said, taking a step forward. The crowd around were disappointed by the prospect of his absence, but Overhaul didn't even look at them as he turned. Hisashi had no choice but to follow the vampire away from the safety of the crowd. He just hoped that wherever he was, Shouta was having better luck than him. We're at Overhaul's ball now. Oh my god, what can go wrong? Everything can go wrong. So, obviously, we've set it up. Shouta is somewhere in the mansion, a castle. I don't know, they mentioned a castle? Jesus Christ. Somewhere, trying to find his daughter. Hisashi is now being dragged into Overhaul's study. That cannot be good. I really don't have any notes for this chapter, actually. This chapter is a setup chapter. It does really good with setting up the future of these chapters and stuff like that. It's a good setup chapter, I will say. Even including that little I love you and wanting to kiss Shouta. And it's a good setup chapter. It's a really good setup chapter. But yeah. As always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Join our community Discord server. Link is in the description. Socials are also in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.